3 months from now, a woman will sit handcuffed to a hospital bed, police outside, a newborn crying down the hall, and a detective asking one question: where is your husband's body? But right now, Claire Sullivan is living what looks like the perfect life. Millionaire tech CEO husband, Georgetown mansion, baby on the way. She has no idea that in 2 weeks, a single photograph will destroy everything she thought she knew. This is the story of how a pregnant wife became a fugitive, a victim became a warrior, and one woman exposed the most dangerous lie in Silicon Valley. If you love stories about justice and survival, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. The security footage timestamp reads 3 months into the future. A woman sits handcuffed to a hospital bed, her dark hair matted with sweat, hospital gown stained with blood and amniotic fluid. Through the small window in the door, 2 police officers lean against the wall, waiting. Somewhere down the corridor, a baby cries, the sound raw and desperate, cutting through the sterile air. A detective's voice, gruff and tired, cuts through the silence. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is your husband's body? The woman doesn't answer. She just stares at the wall, eyes hollow, as if she's looking at something far beyond this room, beyond this moment, beyond everything. But that's not where this story begins. That's where it ends, or maybe where it transforms into something else entirely. To understand how Claire Bennett Sullivan ended up in that hospital room, handcuffed and broken, we need to go back 3 months to a morning that seemed perfect in every way. 3 months earlier, Claire stood in the kitchen of her Austin home, morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a carefully manicured garden. At 7 months pregnant, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone constantly aware of the precious life inside her. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the flutter of movement that never failed to make her smile. The house around her was a modernist masterpiece, all clean lines and expensive restraint, the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines with captions about thoughtful design and organic luxury. Her husband Derek had designed it himself after Nexus AI, his artificial intelligence company, went public and made him $100 million before his 40th birthday. Derek Sullivan was everything the tech press loved: brilliant, charismatic, self-made. He'd grown up in a middle-class family in San Antonio, worked his way through MIT, and built an empire on the strength of an algorithm that could predict consumer behavior with frightening accuracy. Claire sliced strawberries for her breakfast, the knife moving in practiced rhythm against the cutting board. She'd been an investigative journalist once, the kind who broke stories about Silicon Valley fraud and corporate corruption. She'd won a Polk Award at 28 for exposing a venture capital firm that was systematically defrauding immigrant entrepreneurs. She'd been good at her job, really good. The kind of reporter who could smell a lie from across a room. That was how she'd met Derek. Actually, she'd been investigating data privacy violations at TechVantage Corporation, one of Nexus AI's biggest competitors. Derek had reached out through a secure channel, offering to be a confidential source. He'd given her documents, emails, insider testimony. The story had been huge, bringing down TechVantage's CEO and half their board of directors. Derek had seemed different then, a whistleblower with a conscience, someone willing to risk his career and reputation for what was right. When he'd asked her to dinner 6 months after the story ran, she'd said yes. When he'd proposed on the beach in Big Sur 18 months later, she'd cried and said yes again. The wedding had been beautiful, intimate but elegant, and somehow the photos had gone viral. The reformed tech bro and the journalist who'd almost exposed him, now building something beautiful together. People ate it up. Claire had eaten it up too. She'd quit journalism after the wedding, telling herself it was to avoid conflicts of interest, that it wouldn't look good for an investigative reporter to be married to a tech CEO. Derek had supported the decision, had even seemed relieved. "You've worked so hard for so long," he'd said, pulling her close. "Don't you want to just breathe for a while? We can start a family, travel, do all the things we never had time for." And she had breathed. She'd painted and taken cooking classes and volunteered at the Contemporary Austin Art Museum. She'd gotten pregnant on their first anniversary, and Derek had been overjoyed. He'd surprised her at a charity gala by putting their ultrasound photo on the jumbo screen. Everyone had applauded. It had felt like a fairy tale. Her phone buzzed on the marble counter. pulling her from her thoughts. A text from Tessa Morgan, her best friend since college and an ER nurse at Del Seaton Medical Center. Coffee tomorrow, need to see your face before that baby steals you forever. Also have hospital gossip that will make your journalist brain explode. Claire smiled, typing back a yes with several coffee emojis. She set the phone down and noticed something wedged behind the expensive Italian coffee maker that Derek had insisted they needed. A receipt, cream-colored and heavy, the kind of paper that signaled luxury. She pulled it free and unfolded it, expecting to see another overpriced coffee subscription or artisanal bean delivery. Cartier, a diamond tennis bracelet, $18,473. Purchased 6 weeks ago on a Thursday afternoon. Her heart performed a strange little stutter, a skip beat that felt like missing a stair in the dark. She'd received no bracelet. Their anniversary wasn't until October, still 3 months away. Her birthday had passed in March with dinner at Uche and a sensible watch. Beautiful but nowhere near $18,000. Derek's mother's birthday was in January. His sister didn't wear jewelry. Claire turned the receipt over, looking for any notation. Any clue? Nothing. Just the stark proof of purchase. The date, the timestamp. 2:14 in the afternoon on a Thursday. She pulled out her phone and checked her calendar for that date. She'd been at a doctor's appointment. Derek had texted her that afternoon asking how it went, if the baby was healthy, if she needed anything. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, the confident rhythm of a man who owned every space he entered. She had maybe 10 seconds to decide what to do with this information. This little crack in the perfect surface of their life. The journalist in her, dormant but not dead, whispered evidence. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Claire slipped the receipt into her wallet, behind her insurance card, and turned back to her strawberries just as Derek appeared in the kitchen doorway. Morning, beautiful. He crossed to her and kissed her cheek, his hand automatically finding her swollen belly. How are my girls? Did Grace keep you up kicking again? We're good. She's been quiet this morning. Claire kept her voice light, easy. You're up early. Board meeting got moved to 8. Blake's panicking about the TechVantage merger numbers. Derek pulled his phone from his pocket, already scrolling through emails with the distracted efficiency of someone who was always half somewhere else. I might be late tonight. These talks are getting intense. No problem. Tessa and I are having coffee anyway. Give her my best. He grabbed a protein shake from the fridge, the same brand he'd been drinking for years. Vanilla with extra collagen. Love you. Love you too. Baby Grace. He kissed her forehead and was gone, the garage door rumbling, his Tesla pulling away with its characteristic silence. The house settled into quiet around Claire. She stood holding her knife, surrounded by sliced strawberries, and realized her hands were shaking slightly. It was probably nothing. A gift for a business associate. Maybe a thank you for an investor. Derek dealt with high-level negotiations all the time. Expensive gifts were just part of that world. But Claire's journalist instincts, honed over a decade of chasing down lies and exposing fraud, were whispering something else. And those instincts had never failed her before. She pulled the receipt back out and took a photo of it with her phone. Then she opened a new folder in her Photos app and labeled it Receipts, just in case. Old habits from her reporting days. Always keep the evidence. Always trust the story before you trust the person telling it. Outside the window, a cardinal landed on the bird feeder, bright red against the green of the garden. Claire watched it for a moment, then forced herself to eat the strawberries even though her appetite had completely vanished. She had a doctor's appointment at 2 with Dr. Meredith Lane, her OBGYN. Everything was fine. Everything had to be fine. She almost believed it. But somewhere in her chest, in the place where intuition lived, a small alarm bell had started ringing. And Claire Bennett Sullivan, former investigative journalist, knew better than to ignore alarm bells. They always meant something. You just had to figure out what before it was too late. 2 weeks passed in the careful choreography of their life together. Claire attended Derek's company events, smiled for photographs at the Nexus AI charity gala, played the role of the glowing, expectant mother with practiced ease. But she'd started noticing things, small things, the kind of details a good journalist never missed. Derek's phone was always face down now, positioned carefully on whatever surface he set it on, screen away from prying eyes. He'd changed his passcode from her birthday, 4 digits she'd known by heart, to something longer that he typed quickly when he thought she wasn't looking. The subtle way he'd lean away from her when a text came through, his body language shifting from open to guarded in a microsecond. He was working later, coming home after she'd gone to bed, claiming the TechVantage merger negotiations were in a critical phase. His clothes smelled different sometimes, not of another perfume exactly, but of spaces she didn't recognize. Expensive restaurants, hotel conference rooms, places where deals were made and secrets were kept. Claire started a new habit. Every evening when Derek claimed to be working late, she'd check Find My iPhone, the location sharing app they'd set up when she got pregnant. Just in case of emergencies, Derek had said, smiling. So we can always find each other. She'd thought it was sweet then. Now she understood it was a leash, a way for him to know where she was at all times. But it worked both ways. On a Tuesday evening, Derek called to say he'd be late. Investor dinner in Round Rock, he said, his voice smooth and believable. Some venture capital guys from California. Blake and I need to wine and dine them. Don't wait up. Claire said okay, said she loved him, hung up. Then she opened Find My iPhone and watched the little green dot that represented her husband. It didn't move toward Round Rock. It stayed downtown. Settled at an address she recognized, the Four Seasons Hotel. She told herself there could be 100 explanations. Maybe the dinner location had changed. Maybe the investors were staying at the Four Seasons. Maybe Derek just hadn't updated her on the new plans. But her journalist brain, the part of her she'd tried to retire, was screaming now. And Claire had learned long ago to trust that scream. On Thursday afternoon, Claire felt the first contraction. It seized her low and sharp, stealing her breath and making her grip the edge of the kitchen counter so hard her knuckles went white. She checked the time, 2:15 in the afternoon. Too early. Grace wasn't due for 9 more weeks. This couldn't be happening. She called Derek immediately, hands shaking as she pressed his contact. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, and she could hear noise in the background, voices and music, the ambient sound of somewhere public and crowded. Babe, I can't talk right now. I'm in the middle of something. Derek, I think something's wrong. I'm having contractions. Braxton Hicks, probably. Didn't Dr. Lane say that's normal in the 3rd trimester? His voice was distracted, dismissive in that way that made her feel small and silly for bothering him. And this doesn't feel normal. It really hurts. Can you come home? Claire, I'm in Dallas. Remember the investor meetings I told you about this morning? I'm literally in the middle of a presentation. Call Dr. Lane. She'll tell you it's fine. I love you. Gotta go. The line went dead before she could respond. Claire stared at her phone, another contraction building in her lower back. Dallas. He'd said Dallas. She'd been so distracted by the pain that she'd barely registered it. But now the word echoed in her head. With trembling fingers, she opened Find My iPhone again. The little green dot that represented Derek Sullivan wasn't in Dallas, 3 hours north. It was 10 minutes away, still at the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Austin. He'd lied, directly, specifically, unnecessarily lied. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, making her cry out. She pressed her hand against the wall, breathing through it the way she'd learned in her birthing class. When it passed, she stood in her kitchen, alone in her beautiful house, and made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt absolutely necessary. She grabbed her keys and her purse. She probably shouldn't drive. She definitely shouldn't confront him. But something primal had taken over. The same instinct that used to drive her to chase down sources at midnight and break stories nobody else would touch. She needed to see. She needed to know. The drive downtown was a blur of pain and traffic lights and the peculiar clarity that comes with adrenaline. She parked badly at the Four Seasons, taking up 2 spaces, not caring about the irritated valet who approached her. Inside, the lobby was all understated luxury, the kind of place where rich people conducted business over cocktails and closed deals with handshakes that meant millions. Claire moved through it like a ghost, one hand pressed to her belly where Grace was doing gymnastics, the other clutching her phone like a lifeline. She followed some terrible magnetic pull toward the restaurant, her legs moving on autopilot. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, she saw him. Derek sat at a corner table, the best table with a view of the city, leaning close to a woman Claire had never seen before. She was beautiful in that inevitable Instagram way, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and a face that had clearly known the touch of expert injectors. She wore a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she was laughing at something Derek had said, her hand reaching across the table to touch his. And then Claire saw it, the woman's other hand, resting on her own belly. Not flat, not slim, rounded, pregnant. The world tilted sideways. Claire's vision went spotty at the edges. Little black bees swimming in her peripheral vision. She felt wetness between her legs and looked down to see blood spreading across her white maternity dress, dark red against the fabric. Too much blood. Way too much blood. A hotel security guard materialized at her elbow. Ma'am? Are you okay, ma'am? Can you hear me? She couldn't answer. Her knees buckled, and the guard caught her, lowering her carefully to the polished marble floor. Through the window, she could still see Derek, still laughing, completely unaware that his wife was bleeding out 20 feet away, that his daughter might be dying, that everything was falling apart. Someone call 911, the guard shouted, his voice echoing through the lobby. We need an ambulance. The last thing Claire saw before the pain swallowed her completely was Derek through the window, finally looking up, finally noticing the commotion. Their eyes met across the glass, and in that fraction of a second, she saw something flicker across his face. Not concern, not love, something else. Something that looked almost like calculation. Then everything went black, and Claire fell into darkness with her daughter's heartbeat fluttering against her own. Claire woke in a hospital room, harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of antiseptic and fear sharp in her nose. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why, and then it all came rushing back: the pain, the blood, Derek's face through the glass, the pregnant woman's hand on her belly. The baby. Claire's voice came out as a croak, her throat raw from screaming she didn't remember doing. Grace is fine. Tessa stood beside the bed, still in her scrubs from her shift in the ER, her face tight with worry and something else, something that looked like rage barely contained. It was false labor, stress-induced, but you were spotting pretty badly. They want to keep you overnight for observation. Your blood pressure is through the roof. Claire closed her eyes, relief washing over her so powerfully she felt dizzy. Grace was okay. Her daughter was safe. Everything else could be dealt with later. Derek's here, Tessa said quietly. He's been out in the waiting room for the past 3 hours, looking appropriately concerned. Should I tell him to go to hell, or do you want to do that yourself? Despite everything, Claire almost smiled. Tessa had been her roommate at UT Austin, had held her hair back during bad breakups and worse hangovers, had been her maid of honor at the wedding, even though she'd privately told Claire that Derek seemed too smooth, like a politician selling something. What happened? Claire asked. After I passed out. Hotel security called it in. You were brought here by ambulance. Derek showed up about an hour later, full of concern and confusion. He gave a very convincing performance about being in Dallas for business. Said you must have gotten confused about his schedule because of pregnancy brain. Tessa's voice was acid. He's good. I'll give him that. Half the nurses think you're the unstable one. There was a woman at the restaurant. She was pregnant. I know. Security footage shows you staring through the window before you collapsed. Derek's claiming it was a business lunch with a potential investor who happens to be expecting. He's got receipts, meeting notes, the whole thing documented. Of course he did. Derek was nothing if not thorough. Claire felt something cold and hard settling in her chest, replacing the panic with something more dangerous: clarity. Tessa, I need you to do something for me. Don't argue. Just listen. Claire gripped her friend's hand. In my wallet, there's a receipt from Cartier. Take a picture of it. Then I need you to find me someone, a private investigator, someone discreet who doesn't advertise and won't talk to the press. Claire, I was a journalist for 10 years. I know what a liar looks like, and I know how to build a case, but I can't do this while I'm 7 months pregnant and on bed rest. I need help, professional help. Tessa was quiet for a long moment, studying Claire's face. Then she nodded. I know someone, a guy named Joel Price. He used to be Austin PD, homicide detective, until he had a bad stretch and lost his badge. He's been sober for 3 years, and he's the best investigator I know. He also owes me a favor because I let him use the hospital parking when he's staking out cases downtown. Can you call him? Already texting him. Tessa pulled out her phone. But Claire, you need to be smart about this. Don't confront Derek. Don't let him know you suspect anything. Men like him are dangerous when cornered. I know. That's why I need evidence first. Claire closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her. When Derek comes in, I'm going to pretend everything's fine. I'm going to be the worried wife who had a pregnancy scare. And while he thinks I'm being emotional and irrational, I'm going to find out exactly what he's been lying about. And if it's bad, then I'll make sure everyone knows that's what I do. Remember, I exposed the truth. When Derek finally came into the room, he was perfect. Concerned, apologetic, full of gentle touches and soft words. He held her hand and kissed her forehead and whispered about how scared he had been. Claire watched him like she was watching a performance, cataloging every micro-expression, every too smooth phrase. I'm so sorry I wasn't there immediately, he said, his voice heavy with practiced regret. I should have come home when you first called. I just thought it was Braxton Hicks, and the investors were so important for the merger. God, Claire, if anything had happened to you or Grace, I never would have forgiven myself. It's okay, Claire heard herself say, her voice small and believable. I probably overreacted. Pregnancy hormones make everything feel like an emergency. No, you were right to call. I should have dropped everything. He squeezed her hand. From now on, you're the priority. You and our daughter. Nothing else matters. It was a beautiful lie, delivered with Oscar-worthy sincerity. And if Claire hadn't seen him through that window, hadn't watched him laugh with a pregnant woman while his wife bled out in the lobby, she might have believed it. But she had seen, and she would never unsee it. And Derek Sullivan had no idea that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life by underestimating the woman he'd married. Because Claire Bennett had built a career on exposing powerful men who thought they were untouchable. And she was about to do it one more time. Joel Price met Claire 3 days later at a coffee shop in Hyde Park, far enough from downtown and Derek's world that they could talk without being seen. He was in his mid-40s with graying hair, a weathered face, and eyes that had clearly seen too much. He looked like what he was, a good cop who'd made bad choices and was trying to rebuild something from the wreckage. Tessa says you need help with a domestic situation, Joel said without preamble, stirring sugar into black coffee. Before we start, I need to know something. Are you in immediate danger? Is your husband violent? Not physically, at least, not yet. Claire pulled out her phone and showed him the Cartier receipt, then walked him through everything: the lies, the location tracking, the woman at the Four Seasons, the fake pregnancy. I need to know who she is and what Derek's hiding, but I need it documented legally. Something that would hold up if this goes to court. Joel nodded slowly. I can do surveillance, financial records, if you can get me access to accounts, background checks. But Mrs. Sullivan, Claire, you need to understand something. If your husband is having an affair, that's one thing. Messy, painful, but straightforward. If he's involved in something criminal, if there's corporate espionage or fraud involved, this could get dangerous. Men who have a lot to lose tend to get desperate when cornered. I know. I spent 10 years investigating tech fraud. I've had people threaten to sue me, blacklist me. Worse, but I always got the story. This isn't a story. This is your life. Exactly. That's why I need to know the truth. Claire met his eyes. Derek controls everything: the money, the house, our social circle. I gave up my career to be his wife, but I kept my trust fund from my father's estate, and I want to use it to protect myself and my daughter. Whatever it costs, I need to know what I'm really dealing with. Joel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, give me 2 weeks. Stay calm. Don't change your behavior. Don't confront him about anything. Let me work. Those 2 weeks were the longest of Claire's life. She moved through her days in a fog, playing the role of the expectant mother while her mind spun with possibilities. She went to doctor's appointments where Dr. Lane warned her about her blood pressure and stress levels. She had lunch with Derek's mother, who talked excitedly about becoming grandmother. She attended a baby shower thrown by women she barely knew, wives of Derek's business associates, and smiled while they gave her expensive gifts she didn't need. And every night she lay awake beside Derek while he slept peacefully, wondering who he really was. Joel's reports started coming in encrypted emails that Claire read on a burner phone she'd bought for cash at a convenience store. The woman's name was Vanessa Hart. She was 29, an Instagram influencer and brand consultant with 2 million followers and a lifestyle that screamed money. She owned a condo in the Seahome district, drove a new Porsche Taycan, wore designer clothes in every photo, but it was the second report that made Claire's blood run cold. Vanessa wasn't just an influencer. She was a consultant for TechVantage Corporation, Nexus AI's biggest competitor. The same company Derek had helped Claire expose 3 years ago. The same company that had sworn revenge, that had threatened lawsuits, that had lost billions when their fraud was revealed. Joel's third report included photographs time-stamped and geotagged. Derek and Vanessa at restaurants, their body language intimate, Vanessa entering and leaving Derek's downtown office after hours. Derek's Tesla parked overnight at Vanessa's building, and a paper trail the Cartier bracelet was registered to Vanessa Hart. The Seahome condo was owned by a shell company called Cascade Holdings, which was funded through one of Derek's offshore accounts. But Joel found something else, something that transformed this from a simple affair into something far more sinister. Financial irregularities in Nexus AI's books, money moving through shell companies with names like Vertex Solutions and Paradigm Capital, large transfers coinciding with major Nexus announcements. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look. Derek was systematically siphoning money out of his own company. "Your husband's not just cheating," Joel told her in their fourth meeting, his voice grim. "He's cooking the books. This looks like preparation for insider trading or a strategic bankruptcy. I think he's planning to tank Nexus AI stock right before the TechVantage merger, make millions on short sales, then disappear into his offshore accounts." Claire felt like she was back in her journalist days, that familiar rush of a big story coming together. But this time it was personal. This time she was part of the story. "There's something else," Joel continued. "Your husband's business partner, Blake Howard, I ran a background check. He's on TechVantage's investor list, has been for 3 years. He's got financial ties to the same people who are backing Vanessa." The betrayal hit Claire like a physical blow. Blake, who she'd thought of as a friend, who'd come to their wedding, who'd given a toast about how Derek had finally found someone who could keep up with him intellectually. Blake, who she'd been planning to approach for help. "They're all in on it," she whispered. "Looks that way." And Claire is shifting. "There's something else you need to know. I found 2 other cases in other cities. Different tech executives, different companies. Same pattern. Vanessa gets close, gains their trust, extracts information. Then TechVantage or its affiliates short the stock and leak damaging information. She's done this before. She's a professional." Claire sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't just an affair. This was industrial espionage, fraud, conspiracy. And she'd walked right into the middle of it by marrying Derek Sullivan. "What do I do?" she asked. "Honestly, take the evidence to the FBI. Let them handle it. Get yourself and your baby somewhere safe." But Claire was already shaking her head. "If I go to the FBI now, Derek will lawyer up immediately. He'll claim I'm an unstable pregnant woman trying to destroy him out of jealousy. He'll use every resource he has to discredit me before the investigation even starts. I need something bigger, something undeniable." Like what? Claire thought back to her journalism days, to the stories that had really moved the needle. It wasn't just about having evidence. It was about having the right kind of evidence, presented the right way, to the right audience. "I need to find his victims," she said slowly. "The other companies he's destroyed, the other people Vanessa has targeted. I need to build a pattern so clear that no one can ignore it. And I need to do it before Derek realizes I know anything." Joel looked at her with something like admiration. "You're going to investigate your own husband." "I'm going to expose him. That's what I do." Claire stood up, her pregnant belly leading the way, and felt something shift inside her. Not the baby moving, but something deeper. A return to herself, to the person she'd been before she'd given up everything to be Derek Sullivan's wife. She was Claire Bennett again, and she was going to burn his empire to the ground. But Claire had underestimated how quickly Derek could move, how thoroughly he'd planned for every contingency. She should have remembered that you don't build a $100 million company without being ruthless. She should have remembered that the Derek who'd helped her expose TechVantage 3 years ago had been playing a long game even then. She realized her mistake too late. On a Thursday night when everything fell apart, Claire had spent the day compiling evidence, cross-referencing Joel's reports with her own research. She'd found 3 other cases tech executives in Seattle, Boston, and San Francisco who'd been targeted by Vanessa or women with similar patterns. One of them, Christopher Hayes from a robotics firm, had killed himself 6 months ago after losing everything. His widow had tried to sue but been buried under legal motions. Claire was on the phone with Joel, discussing how to approach these other victims, when she heard Derek's key in the door. He was home early, which was unusual. She quickly ended the call and closed her laptop. Derek walked into the living room, his face a careful mask. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About your little investigation." He sat down across from her, calm and controlled. "Did you really think I wouldn't know that I wouldn't have my own security monitoring everything, Claire? I've known what you've been doing since the day you hired Joel Price." The bottom dropped out of Claire's stomach. "Derek, let me tell you how this is going to work." His voice was cold now, all pretense of the loving husband gone. "You're going to sign divorce papers. I'll give you $2 million. You'll sign away all custody rights to Grace, and you'll never see her again. You'll sign an NDA agreeing never to speak about me, Nexus AI, or anything you think you've discovered. You can't take my daughter." "Can I? Let's think about this strategically." Derek counted on his fingers like he was presenting a business plan. "You have a documented history of depression. You were hospitalized last year after your father died. You've been exhibiting erratic behavior, hiring private investigators to stalk your husband. You collapsed in public from stress-induced symptoms. What judge is going to give a newborn to someone so clearly unstable?" "I'm not unstable. You're having an affair and committing fraud." Derek smiled, and it was the cruelest thing Claire had ever seen. "Am I? Or is that what a jealous, hormonal woman believes because she can't accept that her husband has a demanding career?" "Claire, I have documented proof of every business meeting. I have witnesses who will testify that Vanessa Hart is a professional consultant who I've maintained appropriate boundaries with. I have recordings of you making threats against me." "What recordings? I never—" He pulled out his phone and played audio of her voice. "I could kill you for this. I swear to God, Derek, I could kill you." It was her voice, unmistakably her voice, but she'd never said those words. The realization hit her like ice water. He'd used his own company's AI technology to create a deepfake of her voice. "That's not real," she whispered. "Can you prove that in court against my lawyers?" Derek leaned forward. "Here's your choice. Claire, option 1, you take the $2 million, disappear quietly, and start over somewhere else. You'll be financially secure. You can go back to journalism if you want. You just won't have Grace. Option 2, you fight me. I bury you in legal fees you can't afford. I use every tool at my disposal to prove you're an unfit mother. By the time I'm done, you won't just lose Grace, you'll lose everything, including your reputation. No one will hire you. No one will believe you. You'll be the cautionary tale people tell about women who can't let go." "Why are you doing this?" Claire's voice broke. "I loved you. I gave up everything for you. And I appreciate that. You were exactly what I needed at the time, credible, respected, someone who made me look good. But things change. Business evolves. Vanessa is more useful to me now. She has connections I need, information that's valuable. You're just the pregnant wife who was supposed to stay in her lane and look pretty at charity events." He stood up, smoothing his shirt with that casual arrogance she'd once found attractive. "You have until tomorrow to decide. $2 million and a quiet exit, or total war. Choose wisely. Claire, you're a smart woman. Do the math." He walked out, leaving her sitting there, the baby kicking frantically in her belly as if sensing her mother's terror. Claire sat in the gathering darkness, her mind spinning, trying to find a way out, a path forward. She'd been so focused on gathering evidence that she hadn't protected herself. She'd assumed truth would be enough. But Derek had taught her a final, bitter lesson: truths didn't matter if you couldn't make anyone believe it. She pulled out her burner phone with shaking hands and called Joel. He knows. He's known the whole time. It's all been a setup. Get out of that house. Now, go to Tessa's. I'll meet you there. But before Claire could move, before she could even stand up, she heard sirens. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows. Someone pounded on the door. Austin police open up. Claire opened the door to find two officers on her porch, their faces professionally neutral. Mrs. Sullivan, we need you to come with us. What? Why don't I mind? Your husband filed a report. He says you attacked him tonight. He has injuries and a recording of you making threats. Ma'am, we need you to come down to the station. They wouldn't let her change. They wouldn't let her pack a bag. They put her in the back of a patrol car in her yoga pants and maternity shirt, and Claire saw her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, watching from her window, phone in hand, already spreading the news. By the time they got to the station, Claire's picture was on local news websites. Tech CEO's pregnant wife arrested in domestic dispute. Derek's PR team had clearly been ready. The story already crafted and distributed. At the station, they showed her the evidence, the audio recording of her threatening Derek, photographs of scratches on his face and arms, deep and convincing, a timeline of her erratic behavior that made her look like a woman spiraling out of control. Her court-appointed lawyer was a tired woman named Patricia Walsh, who'd clearly seen this scenario play out 1,000 times before. She had the weary efficiency of someone who knew how the system worked and how rarely it worked in favor of women like Claire. Your husband's lawyers are very good, Patricia said, flipping through the file with grim recognition. They're pushing for a restraining order. You'll have to stay away from him in your home. They're painting a picture of escalating instability, and I have to tell you, Ms. Sullivan, it's convincing. But it's not true. He's manipulating everything. The recording is AI generated. He works for an AI company. He has the technology to. Can you prove that? Do you have expert testimony ready? Digital forensics evidence because they have photos, recordings, witness statements. They have a narrative that plays well the brilliant CEO trying to protect himself from his mentally unstable pregnant wife. What about my evidence? The financial fraud, the affair, Patricia held up a hand. Unless you have rock-solid proof that would stand up in criminal court, bringing it up now just makes you look more unstable. It looks like you're making wild accusations to deflect from your own behavior. Claire felt the walls closing in. She'd been outmaneuvered, outplayed. While she'd been gathering evidence, Derek had been building a cage around her, and she'd walked right into it. Your husband is offering a settlement, Patricia continued. $2 million, no custody, sealed NDA. Ms. Sullivan, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. I've been doing this for 15 years. Men with money and power almost always win these cases, especially in family court. You should seriously consider taking the offer. I can't. She's my daughter. Then we fight. But you need to understand the odds. And you need to be prepared for what fighting means: years of custody battles, tens of thousands in legal fees, your entire life scrutinized and picked apart. And at the end of it, you'll probably still lose. They let Claire go that night with an ankle monitor and a court date. She had nowhere to go but Tessa's apartment, a cramped one-bedroom that her friend immediately offered without hesitation. Claire spent that night on Tessa's couch, wearing the ankle monitor like a shackle, feeling her daughter kick inside her and wondering how she'd failed so completely. At 3 a.m, her mother Ruth called. She'd seen the news, had already booked a flight from Phoenix. Mom, I don't know what to do, Claire said, and started crying for the first time since this nightmare began. You fight, Ruth said simply. That's what we do. We fight. But Claire didn't know if fighting was enough anymore. Derek had all the weapons. She had nothing but the truth. And truth, she was learning, was the weakest weapon of all. Ruth Bennett arrived the next morning like an avenging angel in sensible shoes and a pantsuit. She'd spent 30 years in family court and had seen every trick in the book. She took one look at Claire on Tessa's couch, pale and hollow-eyed, and set down her suitcase with purpose. Tell me everything, Ruth said. Don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad. Claire told her, all of it. Ruth listened without interrupting, her face growing harder with each revelation. He's good, Ruth said finally. This is textbook strategy for destroying a spouse's credibility. Isolate her, create a narrative of instability, document everything to look like the victim, force her to choose between fighting and losing everything. So what do I do? We be smarter. Ruth pulled out a legal pad. Derek assumes you'll fold because you're pregnant and scared. He assumes the system will side with him because he has money. And he assumes you've given up on being a journalist. We prove him wrong on all counts. Over the next 3 days, Ruth worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades navigating legal systems. She hired Catherine Brennan, a family law specialist with a reputation for taking on powerful men. She got Joel's reports formally documented. She tracked down Christopher Hayes' widow in Seattle and got her to agree to testify about Vanessa's pattern. But then everything went wrong. Claire woke up on day 4 with a splitting headache and swelling that made her fingers look like sausages. When she tried to stand, the room spun violently. Tessa took one look and called Dr. Lane immediately. 160 over 110, Dr. Lane said grimly, checking Claire's blood pressure. Severe preeclampsia. The stress is poisoning your body. You're at risk for seizures, stroke. The baby's at risk too. Immediate bed rest. If this gets worse, we induce early. But I'm only 31 weeks. She's big enough to survive if necessary. But right now, rest completely. Let others handle everything else. Claire spent the next week in Tessa's guest room, trying to rest while her mind raced. Joel kept working. Ruth coordinated with Catherine. But every update brought worse news. Derek's team had found a flask in her car, claimed she'd been drinking despite clean blood work. They had affidavits from people Claire barely knew, a barista who said Claire seemed erratic, a yoga instructor claiming Claire talked obsessively about being betrayed, Derek's secretary testifying about irrational accusations. The character assassination was working. News coverage shifted from CEO's wife arrested to concerns about pregnant woman's mental state. A psychiatrist who'd never met Claire went on television explaining prenatal psychosis. Claire watched herself being replaced with a fictional monster. Friends were suddenly unavailable. Former colleagues didn't return emails. People believed Derek because he was credible and successful. Who was Claire anymore? Just another pregnant wife who couldn't handle her husband's success. Then, on day 9, Joel arrived with news that changed everything. I found him, Joel said, opening his laptop. Nathan Reeves, Derek's original partner, who supposedly committed suicide 5 years ago. Derek told me they'd grown apart. Derek lied. Nathan was the real genius. He developed the core algorithm. All the early patents list Nathan as primary inventor. Joel showed documents in corporation papers, patents, emails. 3 months before Nathan died, he discovered Derek was stealing from the company, threatened to go public. 2 weeks later, Nathan fell from his balcony. Police ruled it suicide. You think Derek killed him? I think it was convenient, and his widow, Julia Reeves, might still have evidence. She tried to sue, but was shut down by lawyers, forced to sign an NDA. But if she kept Nathan's files, can we contact her? Already did. She's willing to talk. She's been waiting 5 years for someone to listen. Julia flew to Austin 2 days later, bringing boxes of files she'd kept in storage. She met them at Catherine's office, her face haunted but determined. Nathan knew Derek was stealing, Julia said, spreading documents across the table. He documented everything. He was going to the SEC, but then one night he fell from our balcony. Police said suicide, said he was depressed, but Nathan wasn't suicidal. He was angry and scared. She opened Nathan's journal to a marked page. The night before he died, Nathan wrote, Derek knows I'm going to expose him. He's making threats. If anything happens to me, if I have an accident or suddenly become suicidal, investigate Derek Sullivan. He's capable of anything. The words hung in the air, chilling and prophetic. Claire realized Derek wasn't just a cheater and fraud. He might be a murderer. Will you testify? Catherine asked. Yes, but publicly, I'm done being silenced. We expose him everywhere all at once so he can't bury it. The Tech Forward Conference, Claire said suddenly. Derek's keynote in 2 weeks. It's the biggest tech gathering in Texas. If we expose him there, in front of everyone, he can't control the narrative. Catherine looked skeptical. That's risky. Then we don't tip our hand. I'll agree to his settlement. Play the broken wife. While he celebrates, we build the case. Then at the conference, we show them who Derek really is. Ruth studied her daughter. It's dangerous. Then we move fast and smart. I've brought down powerful men before. I just never thought I'd have to do it while 8 months pregnant. They had 13 days. 13 days to build an unassailable case while Derek thought he'd won. Claire was going to conduct it from bed rest in a one-bedroom apartment wearing an ankle monitor. But as she looked at the people willing to fight for her, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: the cold, hard hope of someone underestimated and ready to strike back. The plan came together with military precision. Joel coordinated with Julia, Catherine, and Ruth while Claire directed from bed rest like a general commanding unseen troops. They had 12 days until tech forward. Claire spent them pretending defeat. She signed Derek's divorce papers with Catherine's secret amendments buried in legal language. She texted Derek, "You were right. I can't fight you. I just want this over." Derek responded immediately, "I'm sorry it came to this. You and Grace will be taken care of. I promise." The lies came so easily to him. Meanwhile, Joel found two more of Vanessa's victims, the tech executives whose companies had mysteriously collapsed after being targeted. Thomas Gardner from Boston and Linda Chen from San Francisco, both willing to testify. "And I found something else," Joel reported. "Vanessa's sister, Amanda Cross, has been her accomplice in at least 2 schemes. But Amanda contacted me. She wants to talk." "It's a trap," Ruth said immediately. "Maybe, or maybe she's had enough. Christopher Hayes committed suicide 6 months ago after Vanessa destroyed him. Amanda was reportedly devastated, tried to stop it. She's been pulling back since then." They met Amanda at a coffee shop in Round Rock. She was mid-30s, attractive but exhausted, carrying heavy guilt. "I'm done," Amanda said without preamble. "I've helped Vanessa destroy lives for 5 years. Christopher Hayes had 2 kids, and we drove him to suicide. I can't do it anymore." "Why should we trust you?" Ruth asked coldly. "Because I have everything. Recordings, documents, Vanessa's entire playbook." Amanda pulled out her phone and played audio. Vanessa's voice. "Derek's almost ready. Once we've eliminated the Claire problem permanently, we can move forward. TechVantage is paying us $5 million, plus whatever we make on the trades." "Eliminated permanently," Claire repeated, blood running cold. "Exactly what you think," Amanda said flatly. "After the baby, they're planning an accident, postpartum depression, maybe a tragic fall like Nathan Reeves. Derek gets custody, plays grieving widower. You're gone." Claire pressed her hand to her belly where Grace was moving, as if sensing danger. "Why tell us?" Catherine asked. "Because I'm tired of being complicit in murder. I helped cover up Nathan Reeves. I falsified documents, bribed witnesses. Christopher's death made me realize I couldn't anymore. If I help stop them, maybe I can sleep again." "You're confessing to conspiracy and obstruction," Catherine said. "Prison time." "I know. I'll take a deal if possible. But even if not, I'm done. I'd rather go to prison than help my sister kill another person." Amanda laid out everything: financial schemes, the fake pregnancy belly, the lawyer network helping them. She had recordings of Derek planning Claire's accident, like planning a vacation. "After the baby's born," Amanda explained, "Derek wants devoted father optics, few weeks establishing custody, sympathetic press, then your accident, stairs, overdose, car crash. He inherits everything: your trust fund, Grace, public sympathy, perfect crime." Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. Derek had planned her murder while kissing her goodnight, feeling their daughter kick. The man she'd loved was a monster. "We move fast," Joel said. "If they realize Amanda flipped, they'll accelerate or disappear." 8 days until the conference," Claire said. "Can we build a case that fast?" "We don't have a choice," Catherine replied. "But we're building both a legal and public case. Multiple angles: criminal charges, civil suits, media exposure. Hit Derek from every direction." They split responsibilities. Amanda would go to the FBI with murder conspiracy evidence. Joel would take financial documents to the SEC. Catherine would file emergency motions, and Claire would tell the story. "Tech Uncovered," Claire said, naming the biggest investigative podcast in the industry. "I know the producer, Sarah Martinez. If she'll do an episode, it'll reach millions." Claire called Sarah that night. The producer agreed immediately. They spent 6 hours going through everything: the affair, fraud, Nathan's murder, the plan to kill Claire. Sarah recorded interviews with Julia, Amanda, Thomas, and Linda. "This is huge," Sarah said, eyes bright. "Possibly the biggest tech fraud since Theranos. Are you ready? Once this goes public, there's no taking it back. My husband is planning to murder me. Sarah, I'm not waiting to be his victim." "Okay, we work around the clock." Episode drops in 5 days, 3 days before Tech Forward. It'll build momentum before Derek's keynote. Those 5 days blurred together. Claire gave interviews, reviewed audio, fact-checked obsessively. Her blood pressure remained dangerous. Dr. Lane threatening early induction. But Claire refused. She needed to see this through. Ruth handled legal filings with Catherine, submitting everything simultaneously: custody motions, fraud charges, wrongful death claims, a legal tsunami hitting from every direction. Joel coordinated with federal authorities. The FBI agreed to wait until after the podcast for arrests, wanting public pressure for cooperation. The SEC opened formal investigation into Nexus AI. Then, on a Tuesday morning 5 days before Tech Forward, Tech Uncovered dropped their episode, "The Algorithm of Lies: How Silicon Valley's Golden Boy Built an Empire on Fraud and Murder." The reaction was explosive. Within 2 hours, #1 podcast. Within 4 hours, trending on Twitter. Within 6 hours, every major outlet covering it. Claire had laid it out with devastating clarity: the affair, fake pregnancy, stolen work, murder conspiracy, backed with audio, documents, expert testimony, Derek's voice planning her death, Vanessa celebrating previous scores, Amanda confessing to covering up Nathan's murder. Social media exploded. Hashtag Justice for Claire trended worldwide. TikTok analyzed evidence. Instagram influencers deleted Vanessa partnerships. Nexus AI employees posted anonymously about toxic culture, financial irregularities, ignored warnings. Vanessa's followers dropped from 2 million to 800,000 in 24 hours. Brands canceled partnerships. Previous victims came forward. Derek's image shattered in real time. The brilliant CEO became sociopathic fraudster. The devoted husband became would-be murderer. The self-made success became cautionary tale. Nexus AI's board suspended Derek. Stock crashed 60%. TechVantage merger canceled. In 48 hours after the podcast, FBI agents arrived with warrants for Derek Sullivan and Vanessa Hart. Claire watched from Tessa's apartment, Grace kicking as if celebrating. But Claire felt no triumph, only exhaustion and the hollow knowledge that she'd had to destroy her entire life to save it. Derek's arrest was broadcast live on every major news network. Claire watched on her laptop, her hand resting on her belly where Grace was unusually still, as if even the baby understood the gravity of what was happening. FBI agents led Derek out of the Nexus AI building in handcuffs, his face carefully blank but his eyes scanning for cameras, already thinking about how to control this narrative. Vanessa was arrested at her condo, wearing her prosthetic pregnant belly, which became one of the most widely shared images of the scandal. The fake belly being removed and bagged as evidence was darkly comedic, a perfect symbol of how completely she'd deceived everyone. The charges were extensive. For Derek's securities fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice in Nathan Reeves's death, embezzlement, wire fraud. For Vanessa, conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, accessory to murder. Amanda Cross, true to her word, had already surrendered to authorities and was cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence. Blake Howard, Derek's supposed best friend and business partner, was arrested the next day. His lawyer immediately started negotiating a deal. Blake willing to testify against Derek in exchange for immunity. It turned out Blake had been keeping his own insurance policy, recordings of conversations with Derek about the financial fraud. He'd been planning his own exit strategy all along. The custody order was vacated that same day. Judge Whitmore, clearly embarrassed at being manipulated by Derek's lawyers, personally called Catherine Brennan to apologize. The restraining order was dropped. The domestic violence charges were dismissed. And just like that, Claire was free. But freedom felt strange and hollow. She moved through the next days like a ghost, watching the empire she'd helped build collapse in spectacular fashion. Nexus AI's stock became worthless. Investors filed dozens of lawsuits. Employees lost their jobs. And while Derek was the primary villain, Claire couldn't help feeling responsible for not seeing who he really was sooner. You couldn't have known, Tessa said one night as they watched yet another news segment about the scandal. Sociopaths are good at hiding what they are. That's what makes them dangerous. I'm an investigative journalist. It's literally my job to see through lies. He was your husband. You loved him. Love makes us blind sometimes. That's not a failure. That's being human. 3 days after Derek's arrest, Julia Reeves came to visit. She brought flowers in gratitude, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Claire carefully, mindful of the pregnant belly between them. You did what I couldn't, Julia said. You got justice for Nathan. After 5 years of people telling me I was crazy, that Nathan was just a suicide, finally everyone knows the truth. Thank you. Thank you for believing me. I'm sorry it took so long, Claire said. I'm sorry he got away with it for 5 years. But he didn't get away with it. That's what matters. And now Nathan's name will be cleared. His parents can finally have peace. Thomas Gardner and Linda Chen, the other victims Vanessa had targeted, also reached out. They were filing their own lawsuits now, emboldened by Claire's success. A pattern was emerging. Derek and Vanessa had destroyed at least 7 companies and ruined dozens of lives over the past 5 years. But it was over now. The scheme had been exposed, the predators caught. The Tech Forward conference still happened, but without Derek's keynote. Instead, the organizers invited Claire to speak. She almost said no, still too raw and exhausted. But Ruth convinced her. You have a platform now, her mother said. Use it. Tell people how this happened. Warn them about the signs. Help other women who might be in similar situations. So Claire stood on that stage, 8 months pregnant and wearing a simple black dress that made her look both vulnerable and powerful. She told her story to a silent auditorium full of tech industry leaders. She talked about believing in someone, about ignoring red flags, about the difficulty of recognizing abuse when it comes wrapped in charm and success. Derek Sullivan wasn't a monster in private, she said, her voice steady and clear. He was a monster in public too. We just didn't see it because he knew how to frame his cruelty as ambition, his lies as strategy, his abuse as business savvy. The tech industry rewards this behavior. It celebrates people who are ruthless and calls them visionaries. But ruthlessness in business is often just a preview of ruthlessness in life. She paused, letting the words sink in. If you work with someone who treats their spouse badly, who lies easily, who shows no empathy for the people they've hurt on their way up, believe them. That's who they are. Don't make excuses. Don't tell yourself it's different in business. Character is character, and it shows up everywhere. The applause was thunderous. People stood, and afterward, dozens of people came to her, telling their own stories of toxic bosses, abusive partners, warning signs they'd ignored. She'd touched something, exposed something that needed to be seen. A week later, Claire went into labor. Real labor this time, not stress-induced false contractions, but the genuine article. Tessa drove her to the hospital. Ruth met them there, and after 8 hours of work that made Claire understand the term labor in a whole new way, Grace Sullivan was born. She was perfect. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with Derek's dark hair and Claire's blue eyes. She came out screaming, furious at the world, and Claire fell in love so completely and devastatingly that everything else fell away. All the pain, all the betrayal, all the horror of the past months didn't matter anymore. She had Grace, she had survived, and they were going to be okay. Derek requested to see the baby from jail. His lawyer filed motions for paternal rights, for visitation, trying to maintain some control even from behind bars. Catherine Brennan shut it down immediately, citing the credible threat Derek posed to both Claire and Grace. The judge agreed. Derek Sullivan would have no contact with his daughter until she was 18 and could decide for herself if she wanted to know him. He'll probably still be in prison then, Catherine said. The prosecution is building a case for 20 to 30 years between all the charges. Claire looked down at Grace sleeping in her arms and felt nothing but relief. Her daughter would grow up without knowing her father. She'd grow up safe, loved, protected. That was enough. 6 months later, Claire sat in a small apartment in East Austin, so different from the mansion she'd lost, but infinitely more peaceful. Grace was sleeping in her crib, 6 months old now and already showing signs of a strong personality. She'd gotten Claire's stubborn determination and Derek's intelligence, which was going to be either wonderful or terrifying, depending on the day. The trial had been brutal, but conclusive. Derek was convicted on 8 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 15 bonds. Vanessa got 12 years for her role in the schemes. Blake Howard received probation in exchange for his testimony, but his reputation was destroyed. He'd never work in tech again. Amanda Cross got 8 years but would be eligible for parole in 4. She'd cooperated fully, had shown genuine remorse, and the judge took that into consideration. Before she started her sentence, she came to see Claire one last time. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Amanda said, holding Grace carefully, tears streaming down her face. "I helped destroy your life. I helped cover up murder. But I want you to know that I'll spend every day in prison thinking about how to make this right. And when I get out, I'm going to dedicate my life to helping other victims of people like my sister." "I believe you," Claire said. And strangely, she did. Amanda had made terrible choices, but she'd also made the hardest choice to stop, to turn back, to try to fix what she'd broken. Julia Reeves had used the settlement money from Nathan's wrongful death suit to establish a scholarship in his name at MIT. She and Claire had become friends, bonded by their shared experience of surviving Derek Sullivan. They met for coffee once a month, talking about their healing, their progress, their slow journey back to trusting people. Claire's career had been reborn in ways she'd never expected. The podcast episode about Derek had launched her back into journalism, but on her own terms now. She'd started The Algorithm of Lies, a podcast investigating corporate fraud and tech industry corruption. It was the #3 business podcast on Apple, with sponsorships that paid enough to keep her and Grace comfortable. She'd also started a nonprofit with Amanda's help before Amanda went to prison. They called it Truth Wins, and it helped women leaving abusive relationships navigate the legal system, find resources, and tell their story safely. They'd already assisted 23 women in 6 months, and the work felt more meaningful than any story Claire had ever broken. Her book, also called The Algorithm of Lies, was scheduled to publish in 3 months. The advance had been substantial enough to let her stop worrying about money for a while, but more importantly, it let her control her own narrative, tell the full story in her own words. Derek had tried to write his own book from prison, a memoir called Framed: How I Was Betrayed by the Woman I Loved. His lawyer shopped it around to publishers, but no one would touch it. The evidence against him was too overwhelming. The public sentiment too completely against him. He'd tried to maintain his innocence, but the recordings of him planning Claire's murder made that impossible. The last time Derek had tried to contact Claire, 6 weeks ago, had been through his lawyer. He wanted to explain, to set the record straight, to apologize properly. Claire had Catherine send a single response. "Mrs. Sullivan has no interest in communication with you, now or ever. Any further attempts at contact will be documented and reported to the authorities." She didn't need his apology. She didn't need closure from him. She'd found her own closure in therapy, in the support of friends and family, in building a new life from the ashes of the old one. Tonight was Grace's 6-month birthday, and Claire had invited the people who mattered for a small celebration. Ruth was in the kitchen making enchiladas, the same recipe she'd made for Claire growing up. Tessa was setting up decorations, rainbow streamers, and a banner that said, "Half a birthday." Joel arrived with a ridiculous stuffed giraffe that was bigger than the baby. Catherine brought champagne for the adults and a cake shaped like a butterfly. They gathered around Claire's small dining table, so different from the formal dinner parties she used to host in Georgetown. This was better. These were people who'd stood by her when everything fell apart, who'd fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself. Ruth raised her glass of sparkling cider. To women who refuse to stay silent, to mothers who protect their children, to survivors who become warriors, to Claire, who reminded us all what truth and justice really mean. They clinked glasses, and Claire felt Grace stir against her shoulder. Her daughter's small hand gripped Claire's shirt, holding on with surprising strength. Claire looked down at that tiny, perfect face and thought about the recording she'd made that morning for next week's podcast episode, the Nathan Reeves story. How a brilliant programmer had been destroyed by his partner, how his death had been covered up, how justice had finally come 5 years too late. It was important to tell that story, to make sure Nathan wasn't forgotten in the larger scandal. They try to make you small, Claire said softly, looking at the people gathered around her table. They weaponize your love, your pregnancy, your fear. They use systems that should protect you as weapons against you. They gaslight you into thinking you're crazy for noticing the truth. She paused, her voice growing stronger. But here's what people like Derek don't understand. You can only push someone so far before they stop being afraid and start getting angry. And when women get angry, when mothers protecting their children get angry, we're the most dangerous force in the world. We research, we document, we build cases, we don't quit, and we don't forgive. Well, Grace made a small sound, something between a coo and a laugh, and everyone smiled. The moment was ordinary and perfect people who loved each other, sharing a meal, celebrating a baby's half-birthday. But Claire knew what it had cost to get here. The empire destroyed, the reputation rebuilt brick by brick, the long nights of therapy and healing. Later, after everyone had left and Grace was asleep, Claire sat at her laptop in the quiet apartment. She opened her podcast file for the next episode and began to type. This is Claire Bennett, and welcome to the Algorithm of Lies. Today's episode is about Nathan Reeves, a brilliant programmer whose work revolutionized artificial intelligence. You've probably never heard of him because his partner stole his work, his company, and eventually his life. But Nathan deserves to be remembered, not as a suicide, not as a footnote in someone else's success story, but as a victim of one of Silicon Valley's most horrifying crimes. Her fingers found their rhythm, the words flowing like they used to when she was at her best as a journalist. Outside, Austin glowed against the night sky, full of people building things, destroying things, fighting their own battles. Claire was one of them now, no longer trying to be perfect or safe or small. She was a survivor, a mother, a truth teller, and she had so many more stories to tell. The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting. Claire smiled, cracked her knuckles, and kept writing, because that's what she did. She told the truth, no matter how painful. She exposed lies, no matter how powerful the liars, and she never, ever stopped fighting. Grace made a small in-on from the nursery, settling deeper into sleep. Claire paused her typing to listen, making sure her daughter was okay. The sound of Grace's breathing, steady and peaceful, was the sweetest thing she'd ever heard. This was her life now. Small apartment, big purpose, tiny baby, enormous love, and a mission to make sure what happened to her never happened to another woman if she could help it. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It was better. The trial transcripts arrived 3 days later, delivered by Catherine Brennan in a box heavy enough to represent the weight of everything that had been said. Claire paged through them slowly, reading testimony that had slowly, methodically built the case that destroyed Derek and Vanessa. Derek had maintained his innocence almost to the end, claiming the recordings were AI generated, characterizing Claire as unstable. But the evidence had been overwhelming. Amanda's testimony about the murder conspiracy, Blake's recordings of the financial fraud, Julia's documentation of Nathan's stolen work, and most damningly, Derek's own words, once we've eliminated the Claire problem permanently, we can move forward. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. Claire's podcast had continued growing. The Algorithm of Lies was now the #2 business podcast on Apple, investigating not just individual criminals, but the systems that protected them. She'd done episodes on how tech company boards failed oversight, how NDAs were weaponized, how wealth created two-tier justice. 3 states had introduced legislation to reform NDA laws after her episodes. 2 major tech companies had overhauled their ethics policies. Change was slow, but it was happening. The best moment came quietly. On a Thursday afternoon at the park with Grace, a young woman approached hesitantly. "Are you Claire Bennett?" "I am. I just wanted to say thank you." The woman was crying now. "I was in a relationship like yours. The least side, the gaslighting, the control. I kept thinking I was crazy. Then I heard your podcast, and I realized I wasn't. I left him 2 months ago. I'm safe now. Because of you, I'm safe." The woman hugged Claire quickly, then walked away. And Claire stood there holding Grace, feeling the weight of what she'd done settle over her in a new way. She'd told her story to heal. She hadn't fully grasped it might save others too. That evening, Claire recorded a special podcast episode, not an investigation, but a direct message to anyone who might be where she'd been. If you're recognizing yourself in my story, if you're making excuses for someone's behavior, if you're being told you're crazy for trusting your instincts, I want you to know something. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. If someone who claims to love you is making you feel small, confused, and afraid, that's not love. That's control. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Leaving is hard. Sometimes it feels impossible. But you deserve better. Your children deserve better. And there are people who will help you. She listed resources hotlines, legal aid, her nonprofit's website. Then she finished with her mission statement, truth wins. Not always immediately, not without cant, but eventually, persistently, inevitably. Truth wins. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find your allies. And when you're ready, strike hard and strike completely. The episode went viral within hours, shared across social media, quoted in news articles, played in therapy sessions. Her inbox filled with messages from people sharing their stories, asking for help, offering support. 2 weeks before her book launch, Claire received a letter from Derek, forwarded through his lawyer. She almost threw it away unopened. But curiosity won. The letter was 3 pages of justification. He blamed his childhood, the tech industry culture, Vanessa, even Claire for being too trusting. The last paragraph said, I hope someday you'll forgive me, not for my sake, but for Grace's. Every child deserves to know their father. I made mistakes, but I loved you in my own way. That has to count for something. Claire read it twice, then shredded it. Page by page until Derek's words were just strips in a recycling bin. His love, if it had ever existed, didn't count for anything. Love was action, consistency, sacrifice. Love didn't plot your murder while kissing you goodnight. Grace deserved better. She deserved to know her mother had fought for her, had protected her, had refused to let a monster define their lives. The book launch at Book People sold out within hours. Claire stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and read the dedication aloud. For Grace, who taught me that love worth having is worth fighting for. And for every person who's ever been told they're crazy for trusting their instincts, you're not crazy. You're awake. During the Q&A, someone asked, do you ever regret marrying him? Claire thought carefully. I regret who Derek turned out to be. I regret the pain he caused. But if I hadn't married him, I wouldn't have Grace. And Grace is the best thing that's ever happened to me. So no, I wouldn't change it. I'd just be smarter about seeing the truth sooner. Another person asked, are you angry? Every day, Claire said honestly. I'm angry that someone I loved tried to kill me. I'm angry the system almost let him get away with it. But I'm channeling that anger into something productive. Anger is just energy. It's what you do with it that matters. That evening, Ruth met her at home with wine and a knowing smile. How'd it go? Hard, good, important. Claire sank onto the couch. I think I helped some people. You did. People are calling you inspiring. I don't feel inspiring. I feel like someone who just wanted to survive. That's what makes it inspiring, Ruth said. You took what happened and turned it into something that helps others. That's making meaning from suffering. She paused. Your father would be so proud. He always said you had the strongest moral compass of anyone he knew. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Her father had taught her to stand up for truth, to use her voice for justice. Everything she'd done because of lessons he'd taught her. A month later, Derek filed an appeal. His lawyers claimed ineffective counsel, judicial bias, tainted evidence. Catherine assured her it was frivolous and would fail. He's just using the legal system to feel like he still has power. Ignore it. So Claire did. She focused on her work, her podcast, her daughter. She accepted speaking invitations. She continued building truth wins, helping more women escape dangerous situations. She lived her life with purpose and intention. And slowly, over months and then years, the acute pain of betrayal faded to scar tissue, and finally to a story she could tell without crying. Not because she'd forgotten, but because she'd integrated it into who she was now. She was Claire Bennett, survivor, journalist, mother, advocate. She was someone who had been broken and had forged herself into something stronger. She was living proof that truth did win, that justice was possible, that survival wasn't enough, but thriving was achievable. Every night when she checked on Grace before bed, seeing her daughter sleep peacefully and safely, Claire knew it had all been worth it. Every battle, every terrifying moment, every sacrifice. Because Grace would grow up in a world where her mother had fought for truth and won, where love meant protection, not possession, where strength was measured not by power over others, but by resilience in the face of adversity. The algorithm of lies had been exposed and destroyed. In its place, Claire was building an algorithm of truth, transparent, accountable, human. It wasn't perfect, and it was still under construction, but it was hers, and it was real, and it was helping people. That was enough. That was everything.